Have you ever stood at a funeral and realized that the person everyone was mourning wasn't actually dead? I know it sounds like something out of a horror movie, like one of those impossible scenarios that could never happen in real life, but I'm here to tell you that it happened to me. And what I did next tore my entire family apart in ways I never could have imagined. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I watched my grandmother's coffin being prepared for burial, how I noticed something that no one else saw, and how that single observation led me down a path of unimaginable horror, betrayal, and ultimately, a truth so devastating that it changed everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most in this world. Let me take you back to that cold November morning when I stood in the funeral home, surrounded by my relatives, all dressed in black, all tearfully saying their final goodbyes to my beloved grandmother Margaret. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and roses, those funeral flowers that are supposed to bring comfort, but instead always made me feel suffocated, trapped in a moment I desperately wanted to escape. I had been close to my grandmother my entire life. She raised me after my mother passed away when I was just 7 years old. My father couldn't handle the grief, couldn't handle being a single parent, so he threw himself into his work and left me with his mother. Grandma Margaret became my whole world. She was the one who braided my hair before school, who taught me how to bake chocolate chip cookies from scratch, who stayed up late with me when I had nightmares, who told me stories about her youth and made me believe that I could be anything I wanted to be. She was fierce, independent, sharp as a tack even at 83 years old, and the thought of losing her had been destroying me from the inside out ever since she collapsed 3 weeks earlier. The doctor said it was a massive stroke. They said she was brain dead. They said there was no hope. My Uncle Richard, her eldest son and the one who held her medical power of attorney, made the decision to take her off life support after just 5 days. 5 days. I begged him to wait, to give her more time, to believe in the possibility of a miracle. But he refused. He said it was cruel to keep her alive artificially, that she wouldn't have wanted to live like that we needed to let her go with dignity. I remember the rage I felt, the absolute fury that consumed me when they disconnected the machines. I remember watching her chest rise and fall on its own for those first few minutes, wondering if maybe, just maybe, she would open her eyes and prove everyone wrong. But she didn't. Her breathing became shallow, irregular, and within hours, the hospital staff declared her dead. That was 2 days before the funeral. 2 days that I spent in a fog of grief so profound that I could barely function. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything except replay every memory I had of her in my mind, torturing myself with the realization that I would never hear her voice again, never feel her arms around me, never receive her wise advice when I was struggling with life's challenges. My Aunt Linda, Richard's sister, took charge of the funeral arrangements. She was always the organized one, the one who handled crises with cold efficiency, the one who seemed almost emotionless even in the face of tragedy. She chose the funeral home, selected the casket, wrote the obituary, and planned every detail of the service without asking for anyone's input. I wanted to be more involved, wanted to honor Grandma in a way that felt personal and meaningful, but Linda brushed off my suggestions, telling me I was too emotional to think clearly, that I should just let the adults handle everything. That condescending tone made my blood boil, but I was too exhausted, too heartbroken to fight with her. So I stood there that morning, in the viewing room of Peterson's funeral home, staring at my grandmother's body laid out in a mahogany casket, lined with white satin. She was wearing her favorite blue dress, the one she wore to my high school graduation, the one that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hands were folded peacefully across her chest, her silver hair had been styled beautifully, and someone had applied makeup to her face, trying to make her look alive, trying to create the illusion of peaceful sleep. But she looked wrong. Her skin had a waxy, artificial quality that made my stomach turn. Her lips were too pink, her cheeks too rosy. She didn't look like my grandmother at all. She looked like a doll, a carefully constructed replica designed to provide comfort to the grieving. I hated it. I hated that this was the last image I would have of her. I hated that I had to stand there and accept that she was gone. The funeral director, a tall, thin man named Mr. Peterson with slicked-back hair and a practiced expression of sympathy, was explaining the timeline for the service to my Uncle Richard and Aunt Linda. They would have an hour for viewing and final goodbyes. Then the casket would be closed, the service would begin, and afterward, we would proceed to the cemetery for the burial. Everything was planned, everything was organized, everything was moving forward with horrible inevitability. I couldn't bear to listen to their conversation, couldn't stand the way they discussed my grandmother's funeral as if they were planning a dinner party, So I moved closer to the casket, reaching out to touch her hand one last time. Her skin was cold, which I expected. But there was something else, something that made me freeze. It wasn't quite as cold as I thought it should be. I had touched a dead body before, when my mother died, and I remembered the absolute coldness, the way the skin felt like marble, completely devoid of any warmth or life. But Grandma's hand felt different. It was cool, yes, but not ice cold, not completely lifeless. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief was playing tricks on my mind, that I was so desperate for her to be alive that I was inventing signs that didn't exist. I started to pull my hand away, but then I saw it, the smallest movement, so tiny that if I had blinked at that exact moment, I would have missed it completely. Her eyelid fluttered, just once, just the barest twitch of muscle beneath the skin. I stopped breathing. My heart slammed against my ribcage so hard I thought it might burst through. I stared at her face, waiting, watching, praying that I would see it again, that I hadn't just hallucinated the whole thing. Come on, Grandma, I thought desperately. Please, do it again. Show me I'm not crazy. And then it happened again. Her left eyelid moved, a subtle tremor that lasted less than a second. But it was there. It was real. She was alive. Oh my God, she was alive. The words exploded out of me before I could stop them, loud and frantic, and filled with equal parts terror and hope. She just blinked, I shouted, my voice echoing through the viewing room and causing everyone to turn and stare at me with expressions of shock and concern. My Uncle Richard rushed over, his face a mask of irritation mixed with pity, and I could see in his eyes that he thought I was having some kind of breakdown, that the grief had finally broken me completely. Sarah, honey, I know this is hard, but you need to calm down, he said in that infuriatingly patronizing tone that adults use when they think you're being hysterical. She didn't blink. She's gone. You're seeing things because you're upset. I shook my head violently, grabbing his arm and pulling him closer to the casket. No, I'm not crazy. I saw her eyelid move. Twice. She's not dead, Uncle Richard. Please, you have to believe me. My Aunt Linda approached from the other side, her expression cold and disapproving, and I could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was already deciding how to handle this embarrassing outburst, how to smooth things over with the other relatives who were now gathering around us, whispering among themselves. Sarah, this is completely inappropriate, Linda hissed at me, reaching for my arm as if she intended to physically remove me from the room. You're making a scene. Grandmother is at peace now, and you need to accept that and let her go. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't stand there and watch them close that casket and bury her alive. Because that's what they were going to do. I realized with absolute horror. They were going to put her in the ground, 6 feet under, in a sealed coffin where no one would hear her if she woke up, where she would suffocate in darkness and terror, clawing at the satin lining until her fingers bled, screaming for help that would never come. The image was so vivid, so absolutely terrifying, that I felt bile rise in my throat. I wrenched my arm free from Linda's grasp and turned to Mr. Peterson, who was standing near the door looking deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation. Call a doctor, I demanded, my voice shaking but determined. Call 911. Check her vital signs. Please, I'm begging you, just check. Mr. Peterson exchanged a glance with my Uncle Richard, and I could see the silent communication passing between them, the way Richard gave a subtle shake of his head, the way the funeral director's expression hardened into professional resolve. Miss, I understand this is a very difficult time, Peterson said carefully, but I can assure you that your grandmother was examined by the coroner, that all proper procedures were followed, and that there is no possibility of error. What you're experiencing is a normal part of the grieving process. Sometimes our minds create what we desperately want to see. Normal? There was nothing normal about this. Nothing normal about the way my entire body was screaming at me that something was wrong, that my grandmother was alive in that casket, and no one would listen to me. I felt tears streaming down my face, hot and angry and desperate, and I knew how I must look to them. Like a hysterical young woman who couldn't accept reality, who was so devastated by loss that I had conjured up an impossible fantasy. But I knew what I saw. I knew it in my bones, in my gut, in every fiber of my being. My cousin Jennifer, Linda's daughter, appeared at my side and wrapped her arms around me in what was probably meant to be a comforting embrace, but felt more like a restraint. It's okay, Sarah, she murmured. Let's go outside and get some air. You need to take a break. I tried to resist, tried to stay near the casket, but there were too many hands on me now, too many voices telling me to calm down, to breathe, to step away. They were moving me toward the door, away from my grandmother, and I felt panic rising in my chest like a tidal wave. This couldn't be happening. I couldn't let them do this. In that moment of desperation, I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped struggling against them, let my body go limp as if I was giving up, as if I was finally accepting their version of reality. Jennifer relaxed her grip slightly, and that was all the opportunity I needed. I twisted out of her arms, dodged past my Uncle Richard's grasping hands, and ran straight back to the casket. Before anyone could stop me, I reached down and pressed my fingers against my grandmother's neck, searching for a pulse. The skin was cool but pliable, not stiff with rigor mortis as I had expected. My fingers moved frantically, trying to find the right spot, trying to feel something, anything that would prove I was right. And then I felt it. Faint. So incredibly faint that I almost missed it. But it was there. A pulse. Slow and weak, but definitely a pulse. "She has a heartbeat!" I screamed. And this time I didn't care how crazy I sounded, didn't care that they all thought I had lost my mind. "Someone call an ambulance right now, or I swear to God I will never forgive any of you." The room erupted into chaos. My Uncle Richard was shouting at me to stop being ridiculous. Linda was on her phone, but I couldn't tell if she was actually calling for help or calling someone else, maybe security to have me removed. Other relatives were arguing amongst themselves, some supporting me, saying it couldn't hurt to check, while others insisted I was having a mental breakdown and needed to be taken to a hospital myself. Mr. Peterson had gone pale, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he calculated the potential liability, the lawsuit that could destroy his business if there was even the slightest chance I was right. He pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. I stayed right there next to the casket, my hand on my grandmother's neck, feeling that whisper-thin pulse beneath my fingertips, counting each beat like a prayer. 1, 2, 3, 4. Still there. Still alive. Please, God, let them believe me. Please let help come in time. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was true, but everyone around you insisted you were wrong? Share your story in the comments, because what happened next would test everything I thought I knew about truth, family, and the darkness that can hide behind the people we trust most. The paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. I had never been so relieved to see strangers in my entire life. 2 EMTs, a woman with kind eyes named Rodriguez, and a younger man whose name tag read Chen, came rushing into the funeral home with their equipment, professional and efficient despite the bizarre nature of the call. I could see the skepticism in their expressions, the way they had clearly been briefed that this was probably a false alarm, a grieving relative having a breakdown, but they went through the motions anyway because that was their job. Rodriguez approached the casket while Chen set up their monitoring equipment, and I finally stepped back, my legs shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. Jennifer caught me and helped me into a chair, and for once I was grateful for her presence. I watched as Rodriguez checked for a pulse, her fingers moving expertly along my grandmother's neck, her expression neutral and focused. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Then Rodriguez's eyes widened. "I've got a pulse," she said, her voice sharp and urgent, all skepticism vanishing in an instant. "It's weak and thready, but it's there. Chen, get the gurney. We need to move now." The room erupted again, but this time it was different. The argument stopped. The dismissive looks disappeared. Suddenly, everyone was moving, clearing space, watching in stunned silence as the paramedics worked with swift precision to transfer my grandmother from the casket to their gurney. They attached monitors to her chest, placed an oxygen mask over her face, started an IV line in her arm. The machines began beeping, confirming what I had known all along. She was alive. My Uncle Richard looked like he had been struck by lightning. His face was ashen, his mouth hanging open in disbelief, and I saw his hands trembling as he pulled out his phone to call someone. Probably the hospital, probably the doctor who had pronounced her dead 2 days ago. Linda had gone completely silent, standing frozen in the corner of the room, and there was something in her expression that I couldn't quite read. Not shock, not relief, but something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Mr. Peterson was having what appeared to be a minor panic attack, hyperventilating into a paper bag while muttering about lawsuits and insurance, and how this had never happened in 40 years of business. I didn't care about any of them in that moment. I only cared about my grandmother, about the fact that she was alive, that I had been right, that I had saved her from being buried alive. "Is she going to be okay?" I asked Rodriguez as they prepared to wheel her out. "What happened to her? Why did everyone think she was dead?" Rodriguez shook her head, her expression grave. "I can't answer that right now. We need to get her to the hospital immediately. Her vitals are extremely unstable. Are you family? I'm her granddaughter. I'm coming with you. No one argued with me. I climbed into the back of the ambulance, holding my grandmother's cold hand as we raced toward County General Hospital with sirens blaring. I stared at her face, watching for any other signs of movement, any indication that she might wake up and tell me what had happened to her. How does someone get pronounced dead when they're not actually dead? How does a body end up in a funeral home, prepared for burial, when there's still a heartbeat? The questions swirled through my mind, making me dizzy with their implications. During the ambulance ride, I called my father. He had been traveling for work, some conference in Seattle, and hadn't made it back in time for the funeral. When I told him what was happening, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Sarah, are you sure about this?" he finally asked, his voice strained and strange in a way I had never heard before. "Dad, the paramedics confirmed it. She has a pulse. She's alive. They're taking her to County General right now." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll catch the next flight home. Don't talk to anyone about this until I get there. Do you understand me? Don't say anything to Richard or Linda or anyone else in the family." The intensity in his voice scared me. "Dad, what's going on? Why would you say that?" "Just promise me, Sarah. This is important. Trust me." I promised, though I didn't understand why he was being so cryptic, why he sounded almost frightened. We arrived at the hospital, and my grandmother was rushed into the emergency department, surrounded by doctors and nurses who looked both fascinated and disturbed by her case. I was forced to wait in a private consultation room, pacing back and forth, my mind racing with possibilities and fears. 20 minutes later, my Uncle Richard and Aunt Linda arrived, along with several other family members who had been at the funeral home. They crowded into the small room, everyone talking at once, demanding answers that I didn't have. But I noticed something odd. While most of my relatives seemed genuinely shocked and relieved, Richard and Linda kept exchanging glances, having whispered conversations in the corner, and there was a tension between them that felt wrong, felt calculated. A doctor finally came to speak with us. Dr. Patel, a woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her black hair and an expression of deep concern, introduced herself as the attending physician in the emergency department. "Your grandmother is alive, but her condition is extremely critical," Dr. Patel explained. "She's in what we call a locked-in state, which means she has some level of consciousness but very limited ability to move or communicate. We're running extensive tests to determine exactly what happened and why she was misdiagnosed as deceased." "Misdiagnosed?" Richard's voice was sharp, defensive. "Are you saying the hospital made a mistake?" Dr. Patel chose her words carefully. "I'm saying that something very unusual occurred, and we're investigating all possibilities. What I can tell you is that your mother shows signs of having been administered some kind of sedative or paralytic agent. We've drawn blood for a full toxicology screen, and we should have preliminary results within a few hours." The room went silent. I felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath me. Sedative? Paralytic agent? Those weren't things that just happened accidentally. Those were things that someone did to another person deliberately. I looked at my Uncle Richard and saw his face had gone from pale to bright red. "What are you implying?" he demanded. "Are you suggesting that someone poisoned my mother?" "I'm not implying anything," Dr. Patel said calmly. "I'm simply stating the medical facts as we currently understand them. There will need to be an investigation, and depending on what the toxicology results show, law enforcement may become involved." Linda spoke up for the first time, her voice cold and measured. "This is absurd. Mother had a stroke. She was in the hospital for days. If someone had poisoned her, wouldn't the hospital have caught it then?" "Not necessarily," Dr. Patel replied. "Certain substances can be very difficult to detect unless you're specifically looking for them. And if someone had access to her medication, to her IV lines, it would have been relatively easy to administer something that would slow her heart rate and breathing to the point where she appeared deceased, especially to someone not conducting a thorough examination." My mind was reeling. Someone had done this to my grandmother. Someone had deliberately put her in a death-like state. Someone had wanted her buried alive. But who? And why? I looked around the room at my family members, people I had known my entire life, people I had trusted, and suddenly I didn't recognize any of them. Any one of them could be responsible. Any one of them could be a would-be murderer. The police arrived an hour later. 2 detectives, Ramirez and Foster, began interviewing everyone who had been present during my grandmother's hospital stay and the days leading up to the funeral. They questioned me extensively about what I had seen, about the moment I noticed her eyelid moving, about my relationship with my grandmother. I told them everything, including the fact that my Uncle Richard had made the decision to remove her from life support after only 5 days, which seemed rushed to me even then. I told them about the will, about the fact that my grandmother was quite wealthy, owning several properties and having substantial investments. I told them that there had been arguments in the family about money, about who would inherit what, about the fact that my grandmother had recently talked about updating her will, but hadn't gotten around to it yet. The detective's expressions grew more serious with each detail I provided. They took my Uncle Richard and Aunt Linda into separate rooms for private interviews, and I could hear raised voices, angry denials, accusations being thrown back and forth. The investigation was just beginning, but already I could feel my family tearing apart at the seams. The toxicology results came back 3 days later, and what they revealed changed everything I thought I knew about the people I loved. My grandmother had been systematically poisoned with a combination of benzodiazepines and a muscle relaxant called vecuronium, administered over a period of at least a week. The doses had been carefully calibrated to slow her bodily functions to the point where she appeared dead to a cursory examination, but not enough to actually kill her. It was sophisticated, deliberate, and absolutely terrifying in its calculated cruelty. Vecuronium is a paralytic agent used during surgery. It doesn't cause unconsciousness on its own, which meant that my grandmother had been aware, trapped inside her own body, unable to move or speak or cry out for help, while everyone around her believed she was dead. I couldn't stop thinking about what that must have been like for her, the absolute horror of being conscious but completely paralyzed, hearing people discuss disconnecting her life support, hearing the funeral arrangements being made, feeling herself being moved into a casket. The psychological trauma alone was incomprehensible. The police arrested my Uncle Richard on a Tuesday morning. The evidence against him was substantial. He had worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative for 20 years and had access to the medications found in my grandmother's system. He held her medical power of attorney and had been the one pushing to remove her from life support quickly. He had significant gambling debts that would be resolved by his inheritance. And perhaps most damning, security footage from the hospital showed him entering my grandmother's room alone multiple times during the night shifts when fewer staff members were around. But Richard wasn't working alone. 2 days after his arrest, my Aunt Linda was also taken into custody. The investigation revealed that she and Richard had conspired together, motivated by a toxic combination of greed and resentment. Linda had handled my grandmother's finances for the past 5 years and had been secretly embezzling money, covering her tracks with falsified documents and creative accounting. She knew that if my grandmother updated her will as she had been planning to do, an independent audit would be conducted and her theft would be discovered. She would lose everything and likely go to prison. So she and Richard had hatched a plan. They would poison my grandmother, make it look like a natural death from her stroke, and ensure that she was buried before anyone could discover what they had done. The inheritance would be divided according to the existing will. Linda's embezzlement would remain hidden, and Richard would have enough money to pay off his debts and start fresh. It was cold, calculated, and absolutely monstrous. What they hadn't counted on was me. They hadn't expected that I would be observant enough to notice that subtle eyelid movement. They hadn't expected that I would fight back against everyone's dismissal and insist on medical attention. They hadn't expected that I would save the woman they were trying to murder. The preliminary hearing was held 3 weeks after the arrests. I attended, sitting in the courtroom and watching my uncle and aunt being led in wearing orange jumpsuits and handcuffs. They both looked diminished somehow, smaller than I remembered, stripped of the authority and confidence they had always projected. Neither of them would look at me. When the prosecutor laid out the charges, attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, the litany of crimes was staggering. Richard's lawyer argued that there was no proof of intent to kill, that his client had believed the medications would simply keep his mother comfortable, that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the evidence said otherwise. The careful dosing, the timing, the rush to cremate the body, which was only stopped because I had insisted on a traditional burial so I could have a place to visit, all of it pointed to a deliberate plan to end my grandmother's life. Linda's lawyer tried a different approach, claiming that my aunt had been manipulated by her brother, that she was a victim of his scheme rather than a co-conspirator. But the financial records told a different story. Linda had been stealing from my grandmother for years, and she had everything to lose if the truth came out. The judge denied bail for both of them, citing the severity of the charges and the risk of flight. As they were being led out of the courtroom, Richard finally looked at me. The hatred in his eyes was so intense, so visceral, that I actually flinched. "You should have minded your own business," he hissed at me as the bailiff pulled him past where I was sitting. "You've destroyed this family. Everything that happens now is on you." His words hit me like a physical blow. Part of me, the part that still remembered him teaching me to ride a bike when I was 6 years old, wanted to believe that he was right, that I had made everything worse by not just accepting my grandmother's death and moving on. But then I thought about her lying in that casket, still alive, still aware, being prepared for burial, and I knew that I had done the right thing. No matter what it cost me, no matter how my family fractured, I had saved her life. My grandmother remained in the hospital for 2 months. The paralytic effects of the drugs gradually wore off, and with intensive physical therapy, she began to regain some movement and the ability to speak, though her voice was weak and her words sometimes slurred. The locked-in state had caused some permanent neurological damage, and the doctors said she would never fully recover. But she was alive. She was conscious. She could communicate, and that meant everything to me. The first time she was able to speak clearly enough to have a real conversation, I asked her the question that had been haunting me. "Grandma, do you remember what happened? Do you remember being in the hospital?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed my hand with what little strength she had regained. "I remember everything," she whispered. "I was awake, Sarah. I was awake the whole time. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even open my eyes, but I could hear everything. I heard Richard telling the doctors to stop treatment. I heard them discussing my funeral. I felt them moving me into that casket." Her voice broke on the last word, and I felt my own tears streaming down my face. I tried so hard to move to show them I was still there. I focused every ounce of energy I had on just moving my eyelid, just the tiniest bit, hoping someone would notice. And you did. You saved me, sweetheart. You were the only one who saw me. I held her hand and cried, overwhelmed by the horror of what she had endured and the miracle that she had survived it. She told me more over the following weeks, speaking in short bursts when she had the energy. She told me how Richard had started bringing her special tea when he visited, tea that made her feel strange and drowsy. How Linda would adjust her IV when the nurses weren't looking, and she would feel a cold rush through her veins followed by increasing paralysis. How she had tried to refuse the tea, tried to indicate that something was wrong, but the stroke had already affected her ability to communicate clearly, and everyone thought she was just confused. She told me about the moment when they disconnected her life support, about the terror of wondering if she would actually die this time, if her children's greed had finally succeeded where nature had failed, about the strange twilight existence of being moved to the funeral home, about the indignity of being prepared for burial while still conscious, about the absolute despair of being placed in that casket, about giving up hope that anyone would realize she was still alive. And then she told me about hearing my voice, about feeling me touch her hand, about gathering every last reserve of strength she had to make that eyelid move one more time. "I knew if anyone would notice, it would be you," she said. "You always paid attention, Sarah. You always really saw me, not just what you wanted to see. You saved my life by being exactly who you've always been." My father arrived from Seattle the day after my grandmother was admitted to the hospital, and the conversation we had in the hospital cafeteria opened up an entirely new dimension to this nightmare. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days, and there was a heaviness in his eyes that I had never seen before. We sat across from each other at a small table, untouched coffee cups between us, and he told me things about our family that shattered everything I thought I knew. "Sarah, I need you to understand something about your mother's death," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never told you this because I wanted to protect you, because you were so young and you had already lost so much. But now, with what's happened to Mom, I think you need to know the truth." My heart started pounding. "What are you talking about? Mom died in a car accident. That's what you've always told me." He shook his head slowly, his hands trembling as they gripped his coffee cup. "That's what the official report said. That's what everyone believed. But I've always had doubts, Sarah. Your mother's car went off a bridge on a clear day, on a straight road she had driven hundreds of times. There were no skid marks, no signs that she tried to brake or swerve. The police ruled it an accident, but I could never make sense of it. The cafeteria suddenly felt too cold, too bright, too surreal. What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your mother had just found out something about Richard and Linda. She told me the night before she died that she had discovered financial irregularities in Mom's accounts, that she suspected Linda was embezzling, and that she was planning to confront them both. The next day, she was dead. The implication hung in the air between us, too terrible to speak aloud." My father continued, his voice breaking. "I tried to get the police to investigate further, but I had no proof, just suspicions and timing that seemed too coincidental. Everyone thought I was just a grieving husband looking for someone to blame. looking for a reason why when sometimes there isn't one. Eventually, I let it go because I had you to think about, and I couldn't risk Richard and Linda's retaliation if I was right about them. So I sent you to live with Mom, where I thought you'd be safe, where I thought they wouldn't dare hurt you because it would be too obvious. I felt like I was going to be sick. You think they killed my mother? I think it's possible. And now, seeing what they tried to do to Mom, seeing how calculated and cold-blooded their plan was, I think it's more than possible. I think it's probable. He reached across the table and gripped my hands. Sarah, you need to be careful. Richard and Linda are facing serious charges, but they have money, they have lawyers, and they have everything to lose. I don't trust that they won't try something desperate. They're in jail, Dad. They can't hurt anyone from jail. They have friends, Sarah. They have connections. Richard worked with pharmaceutical companies for decades. Linda knows people in finance, in law, in places I probably don't even know about. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't go anywhere alone, that you'll watch your back. His paranoia seemed extreme in that moment, but I promised anyway, trying to comfort him even as my mind was reeling from the revelation about my mother. Could it be true? Had my mother been murdered by my own aunt and uncle 19 years ago? The thought was so horrific, so incomprehensible that I couldn't fully process it. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit together. My mother's sudden death, Linda taking over my grandmother's finances shortly afterward, Richard becoming the executor of the estate and holding medical power of attorney. It had all happened within a year of my mother's death, as if they had been positioning themselves, removing obstacles, consolidating power. I told Detective Ramirez about my father's suspicions 2 days later. She listened carefully, taking notes, her expression growing more grave with each detail. We'll look into it, she promised. If there's any evidence that your mother's death was not accidental, we'll find it. These types of perpetrators often have a pattern. If Richard and Linda got away with murder once, they would have felt emboldened to try again. The investigation into my mother's death was reopened. Her car, which had been in a salvage yard for nearly 2 decades, was examined by forensic experts. Her medical records from the autopsy were reviewed. People who knew her were re-interviewed, and slowly a new picture began to emerge. A witness who had been traveling behind my mother's car that day, someone who had never been contacted during the original investigation, came forward after seeing news coverage of Richard and Linda's arrest. This witness, a truck driver named James Morrison, stated that he had seen another car following my mother very closely in the minutes before her accident, aggressively tailgating her, and that just before she went off the bridge, it appeared that the other car had made contact with her rear bumper. He had reported this to the police at the time, but his statement had somehow been lost or overlooked in the initial investigation. The forensic examination of my mother's car revealed paint transfer on the rear bumper that matched the make and model of a car that had been registered to my Uncle Richard at the time. The paint was blue, distinctive, and the chemical analysis was a perfect match. Suddenly, my mother's accident looked a lot more like vehicular homicide. Richard and Linda were charged with an additional count of murder in the first degree. The prosecution's theory was that my mother had discovered Linda's embezzlement scheme and had threatened to expose them both. Richard had followed her that day, run her off the road, and made it look like an accident. With my mother out of the way, they had been free to continue stealing from my grandmother for nearly 2 decades, accumulating hundreds of thousands of dollars through creative accounting and forged documents. My grandmother was devastated when she learned the truth about my mother's death. She had mourned her daughter-in-law for 19 years, never suspecting that her own children were responsible for that loss. The betrayal cut deeper than anything else they had done to her. I gave them everything, she said to me one afternoon as we sat in her hospital room, sunlight streaming through the windows. I loved them, raised them, supported them through every challenge. How could they have so little regard for human life? How could they value money more than family? I had no answers for her. I had spent weeks trying to understand the psychology of it, trying to find some rational explanation for how 2 people could become so twisted, so devoid of empathy and conscience. But there was no explanation that made sense, no reason that justified what they had done. Some people, I was learning, were simply capable of monstrous things when greed and self-interest consumed them completely. The trial began 6 months later. It was a media sensation, covered by national news outlets who couldn't get enough of the sensational details. The grandmother almost buried alive, the long-running embezzlement scheme, the possible murder of a young mother 19 years earlier. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row directly behind the prosecution table, making sure Richard and Linda could see me, making sure they knew that I wasn't going to hide, Wasn't going to let them pretend they were the victims in this story. The prosecution presented a devastating case. They had financial records showing the embezzlement. They had medical evidence of the poisoning. They had security footage of Richard entering my grandmother's hospital room. They had the paint transfer evidence from my mother's car. They had testimony from the truck driver who had witnessed the accident. They had my grandmother's own testimony about being conscious while paralyzed, about hearing her children plan her funeral while she was still alive. The defense tried to create reasonable doubt, tried to suggest that the poisoning had been accidental, that the embezzlement was a misunderstanding, that my mother's death was still just a tragic accident despite the evidence. But their arguments were weak, contradicted by the overwhelming physical evidence and testimony. The jury deliberated for only 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Richard was convicted of attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and murder in the first degree. Linda was convicted of the same charges except for the murder count related to my mother's death, as the prosecution could not definitively prove she had known about or participated in running my mother off the road, though she was convicted of accessory after the fact for helping to cover it up. At sentencing, the judge was harsh and unequivocal in his condemnation. "You targeted the most vulnerable members of your own family for financial gain," he stated, looking directly at Richard and Linda. "You showed a callous disregard for human life and dignity that is truly shocking. You betrayed the trust of a mother who loved you, and you stole not only her money but her sense of safety and security in what should have been her golden years. You attempted to bury her alive, conscious and aware, in what can only be described as a living nightmare. And the evidence suggests that this was not your first attempt at murder within your family." He sentenced Richard to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of my mother, with additional consecutive sentences for the other charges totaling another 40 years. Linda received 35 years for her role in the embezzlement and attempted murder of my grandmother, with an additional 10 years for accessory to murder. Neither of them would ever be free again. As they were led out of the courtroom in chains, I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. I felt only a profound sadness for what could have been, for the family we might have had if greed and cruelty hadn't poisoned everything. My grandmother would never fully recover from the physical and psychological trauma of what they had done to her. My mother was still gone, her death no longer an accident but a murder, which somehow made it hurt even more. And I would live the rest of my life knowing that evil could wear familiar faces, that the people who smile at you across the Thanksgiving table could be capable of unspeakable horrors. The aftermath of the trial brought unexpected challenges that I hadn't anticipated. While Richard and Linda were behind bars, their actions had fractured our family in ways that couldn't be easily repaired. Other relatives took sides, some believing that Richard and Linda had been railroaded by an overzealous prosecution, others angry that they had been fooled for so many years. Family gatherings became awkward, tense affairs filled with unspoken accusations and resentment. My cousin Jennifer, Linda's daughter, stopped speaking to me entirely. She blamed me for her mother's imprisonment, insisting that I had misinterpreted what I saw at the funeral, that I had started a chain reaction that destroyed her family. Never mind that her mother had tried to murder my grandmother and had helped cover up my mother's murder. In Jennifer's mind, I was the villain who had torn apart her comfortable life. Some of my other relatives shared her view, whispering behind my back at family events, giving me cold looks, making it clear that I was no longer welcome in certain circles. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. I had saved my grandmother's life. I had helped bring justice for my mother, and yet I was being treated like a traitor, like someone who had betrayed the family by refusing to stay silent. My father tried to shield me from the worst of it, but even he was struggling with his own guilt and anger. He blamed himself for not pushing harder to investigate my mother's death 19 years ago, for sending me to live with my grandmother, where I had unknowingly been living under the same roof as my mother's probable murderers for years. "I should have protected you better," he said to me one night, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have trusted my instincts about Richard and Linda. I should have kept you away from them." "You did what you thought was best," I assured him. "You couldn't have known how far they would go. No one could have imagined this." But the guilt ate at him anyway, and I watched my strong, capable father become increasingly withdrawn and depressed, second-guessing every decision he had made since my mother's death. My grandmother was transferred to a long-term care facility after 4 months in the hospital. She had regained some mobility and speech, but the paralytic drugs and the trauma of her experience had taken a permanent toll. She needed assistance with daily activities, physical therapy 3 times a week, and psychiatric care to help her process the psychological damage of being conscious, while everyone believed she was dead. I visited her every day after work, and we would sit together in her room, sometimes talking, sometimes just being present with each other. She told me stories about my mother, memories I had never heard before, filling in the gaps of a relationship I barely remembered. She told me about my mother's kindness, her intelligence, her fierce protective love for me, her dreams for my future. And she told me how proud my mother would have been of me, how she would have admired my courage in standing up for what was right, even when everyone told me I was wrong. Your mother was like that too, Grandma said. She never backed down when she knew something was wrong. That's why they killed her, Sarah. She wouldn't be silent, wouldn't look the other way. And neither would you. Those conversations became sacred to me, a way of connecting with the mother I had lost and the woman who had raised me, both of whom had been victimized by the same cruel people. Through my grandmother's stories, my mother became real to me in a way she never had been before. She stopped being the abstract concept of my dead mother and became a fully formed person with quirks and passions and flaws, someone I could actually grieve properly, someone I could honor by living my life with the same integrity she had shown. But the nightmares were relentless. I would dream of being paralyzed, trapped in darkness, feeling hands positioning me in a casket, hearing dirt being shoveled onto the lid. I would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart racing with panic. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Michelle Torres, who specialized in trauma and PTSD. She helped me understand that what I had experienced, what I had witnessed, was a form of trauma that would take time to process and heal from. You experienced a fundamental violation of trust and safety, Dr. Torres explained during one of our sessions. You discovered that people you loved and trusted were capable of murder. You saw your grandmother in a casket, believed she was dead, and then realized she was alive and had been nearly buried alive. These are not normal experiences. Your brain is trying to process information that doesn't fit with your previous understanding of the world. The nightmares, the anxiety, the hypervigilance, these are all normal responses to abnormal circumstances. She taught me coping strategies, grounding techniques, ways to manage the anxiety that had become my constant companion. Slowly, over many months, the nightmares became less frequent. The fear became more manageable. I started to rebuild my sense of safety and trust in the world, though it would never be quite the same as it had been before. One unexpected source of healing came from connecting with other survivors of similar experiences. Through a support group, Dr. Torres recommended, I met people who had discovered betrayal in their own families, who had uncovered dark secrets, who had been ostracized for telling the truth. Their stories were different from mine in the specifics, but the emotional core was the same. The pain of betrayal, the isolation of being blamed for exposing wrongdoing, the long journey toward healing and acceptance. These people understood what I was going through in a way that even well-meaning friends couldn't. They didn't offer empty platitudes or try to minimize what had happened. They listened, shared their own experiences, and reminded me that I wasn't alone, that others had walked this painful path and survived it. Their support became invaluable as I navigated the complicated terrain of grief, anger, betrayal, and healing. The financial aftermath of the case was also complex. As the executor of my grandmother's newly updated will, created after she recovered enough to make her wishes clear, I was responsible for managing her estate and ensuring that the money Richard and Linda had stolen was accounted for and redistributed. It was a massive undertaking, requiring forensic accountants, lawyers, and months of painstaking work to trace all the fraudulent transactions. We recovered about 60% of what had been stolen, the rest having been spent on Richard's gambling debts and Linda's expensive lifestyle over the years. My grandmother insisted that a significant portion of the recovered funds be donated to organizations that supported elder abuse, prevention, and victim advocacy. If my suffering can help protect even one other person from going through what I went through, she said, then something good will have come from this nightmare. I also started speaking publicly about what had happened, sharing our story at conferences focused on elder abuse, financial exploitation, and the warning signs of family betrayal. It was terrifying at first, standing in front of strangers and recounting the most painful experience of my life, but it also felt important, necessary. If my grandmother's near-death experience and my mother's murder could serve as a cautionary tale, if our story could help others recognize the signs of abuse and exploitation, then perhaps some meaning could be salvaged from the tragedy. The media attention was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it brought awareness to the issue of elder abuse and the shocking reality that family members are often the perpetrators. On the other hand, it meant that I couldn't escape what had happened. Strangers recognized me, reporters contacted me asking for interviews, and there was no privacy, no ability to simply move on and forget. But I had made a choice early on that I wouldn't hide. wouldn't be ashamed of surviving and speaking the truth, and I stuck to that decision even when it was difficult. 2 years after the trial, my grandmother's health took a turn for the worse. The damage from the paralytic drugs had affected her heart, and she developed congestive heart failure. The doctor said it was a delayed complication, that the stress her body had endured during those weeks of being paralyzed and near death had taken a toll that was only now becoming apparent. I spent every moment I could with her during those final months, knowing that this time, when she left me, it would be real and permanent. We talked about everything: life and death, love and betrayal, forgiveness and justice. She made peace with what had happened to her, an acceptance that I found both admirable and heartbreaking. "I'm not afraid of death anymore," she told me one afternoon as we sat in the sunshine in the facility's garden. "I've already experienced the worst version of it, being conscious and trapped and thinking I would be buried alive. Whatever comes next can't be worse than that. And I'm tired, sweetheart. My body is tired. I'm ready to rest." "I'm not ready to lose you," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "You're all I have left." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "That's not true. You have your father. You have friends who love you. You have a whole life ahead of you. And you have something else, Sarah. You have strength and courage and integrity that will serve you well. You saved my life by refusing to accept what everyone else told you was true. You stood up to your entire family and insisted on the truth even when it cost you dearly. Those qualities will take you far in life. I learned them from you," I said. "And from your mother," she replied. "You're a combination of the best parts of both of us. And that's my legacy, Sarah. Not the money, not the property, but you, the woman you've become, the woman you'll continue to be. That's what I'm leaving behind, and I couldn't be prouder." She died 3 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, with me holding her hand. This time, there was no question about whether she was really gone. This time, I was able to grieve properly, to say goodbye, to know that her suffering was truly over. The funeral was small, attended only by the family members who had supported us through everything, the ones who had believed me, who had stood by my grandmother, who had condemned Richard and Linda's actions. It was the family we had chosen, rather than the one we had been born into, and there was something beautiful about that. As I stood at her grave, watching the casket being lowered into the ground, I thought about how different this was from that day 2 years earlier when I had seen her eyelid flutter in what was supposed to be her first funeral. This time there was no panic, no horror, no desperate fight to save her. This time there was only grief, clean and honest and natural. This time she was truly at peace. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I changed careers, leaving my job in marketing to go back to school for social work, wanting to help others who had experienced trauma and betrayal. I moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city, somewhere without memories of family gatherings and pretend normalcy. I adopted a dog, a rescue named Luna, who had her own history of abuse and neglect, and together we healed, learning to trust the world again. I reconnected with my father, and slowly, painfully, we rebuilt our relationship. He got treatment for his depression and started attending therapy regularly. We talked honestly about my mother for the first time, sharing memories, processing our grief, acknowledging the anger we both felt at having her stolen from us. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks, but we were committed to not letting Richard and Linda destroy us the way they had destroyed so much else. I even started dating again, something I had avoided for years, because I didn't trust my judgment about people anymore. But I met someone, a kind, patient man named David, who worked as a victim advocate and understood trauma in a way that most people couldn't. He didn't run when I told him my story. He didn't treat me like I was broken or damaged. He simply listened, supported me, and helped me see that I was more than the worst thing that had ever happened to me. 3 years after my grandmother's death, I received a letter from my uncle Richard. It had been forwarded through several channels, as I had blocked all direct communication from him and Linda years earlier. I debated whether to read it, whether to allow his words into my carefully rebuilt life, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was strange. Not quite an apology, but something close to it. Richard acknowledged what he had done, admitted that greed and desperation had twisted him into someone unrecognizable. He said he thought about my grandmother every day, about the terror she must have felt, about the trust he had betrayed. He said he understood why I had done what I did, why I had fought for her, and that in a twisted way, he respected me for it. But then the letter took a darker turn. He claimed that Linda had been the mastermind, that she had manipulated him into participating, that he had been weak and foolish but not truly evil. He tried to shift blame, to paint himself as a victim of his sister's influence, and I felt my anger rising as I read his self-serving rationalizations. He ended the letter by asking for forgiveness, not for his sake but for mine, saying that holding on to anger would only hurt me in the long run. I read it 3 times, feeling a complex mix of emotions: anger, disgust, sadness, and something that might have been pity. Then I did something I hadn't expected to do. I wrote back, not to forgive him, not to absolve him of responsibility, but to make sure he understood exactly what his actions had cost. I told him about the nightmares I still had. I told him about my grandmother's final months, the fear and pain she had endured because of what he and Linda had done. I told him about my mother, about finally learning the truth of how she died, about the hole in my life that could never be filled. I told him about the family members who no longer spoke to me, about the relationships that had been destroyed, about the innocence and trust that I would never get back. And then I told him that I would never forgive him, that forgiveness wasn't something he was entitled to, that he would have to find a way to live with what he had done without the comfort of my absolution. I mailed the letter and felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't closure exactly, but it was something. It was refusing to participate in his narrative of redemption, refusing to make his guilt easier to bear. He had made his choices, and he would live with the consequences. I had made mine, and I would do the same. But I was choosing to live, to heal, to find meaning and purpose despite everything that had happened. That was my victory. My revenge, if you want to call it that. Refusing to let their cruelty destroy me. Now, as I sit here telling you this story, 5 years have passed since that terrible day at the funeral home when I saw my grandmother blink. 5 years of healing, growing, learning to trust again, building a life that honors both my mother and my grandmother's memories. I graduated with my master's degree in social work last month. I specialize in working with families dealing with elder abuse and financial exploitation, using my experience to help others recognize the warning signs, to advocate for their loved ones, to find the courage to speak up even when everyone tells them they're wrong. Every client I help, every family I guide through the nightmare of discovering betrayal, feels like a tribute to my grandmother and mother. I married David last year in a small ceremony attended by our chosen family. My father walked me down the aisle, and I carried a bouquet with flowers that had been my mother's favorites. My grandmother's engagement ring, recovered from Linda's possession after her arrest, now sits on my finger as my wedding band. I like to think they were both there in spirit, proud of the woman I've become, the life I've built from the ashes of tragedy. Luna, my rescue dog, has become a certified therapy animal, and she accompanies me to work sometimes, providing comfort to clients who are processing their own trauma. There's something poetic about both of us being survivors who found our purpose in helping others heal. I still have nightmares occasionally, still feel a spike of anxiety when I attend funerals, still struggle with trust issues that probably won't ever completely go away. But I've learned that healing isn't about erasing what happened or returning to who you were before. It's about integrating the experience, learning from it, and choosing to move forward despite the scars. I've learned that evil can wear familiar faces, that trust can be betrayed in the most horrific ways, but also that courage can come from unexpected places. I was just a 28-year-old woman standing at her grandmother's funeral when I noticed that tiny eyelid flutter, but I trusted myself enough to speak up, to fight back against everyone's dismissal, to insist on the truth even when it would have been easier to stay silent. That moment of courage changed everything. It saved my grandmother's life. It brought justice for my mother's murder. It exposed decades of fraud and cruelty. It cost me relationships and brought me trauma that I'm still processing. But it also showed me who I really was, what I was capable of, the strength that I inherited from the strong women who came before me. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had listened to everyone telling me I was wrong, if I had let them smooth over my concerns and proceed with the funeral. My grandmother would have been buried alive, conscious and aware, dying in absolute terror in that sealed casket. Richard and Linda would have gotten away with murder twice. My mother's death would have remained classified as an accident. The stolen money would never have been recovered. The truth would have stayed buried, just like they intended. But I didn't stay silent. I trusted my instincts. I fought for someone who couldn't fight for herself. And that made all the difference. I want you to understand something important, something I've learned through years of working with families in crisis. If you see something that doesn't seem right, if you notice something that others dismiss, If you feel in your gut that something is wrong, even when everyone tells you you're being paranoid or emotional or irrational, trust yourself. Don't let others gaslight you into doubting what you know to be true. Don't let fear of conflict or desire to keep the peace silence you when someone's safety is at stake. Your instincts, your observations, your refusal to accept easy answers could save someone's life. It saved my grandmother's life. It could save someone you love too. I also want you to know that if you're dealing with elder abuse, if you suspect that someone you love is being exploited or harmed by family members, you're not alone. There are resources, organizations, legal protections designed to help. You don't have to fight this battle by yourself. Reach out to adult protective services, to elder abuse hotlines, to victim advocacy groups. Document everything. Trust your instincts. And don't give up, even when the abusers are people you've known and trusted your whole life. The hardest truth I've had to accept is that being family doesn't make someone trustworthy. That blood relation doesn't guarantee love or loyalty. That sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who were supposed to protect us. But the flip side of that truth is equally important. Family is more than biology. The people who showed up for me, who believed me, who supported me through the investigation and trial and aftermath, they're my real family. The ones who chose to stand with me, who valued truth over comfort, who condemned evil even when it wore a familiar face. Have you ever had to make a choice between staying silent to keep the peace and speaking up to protect someone you love? I want to hear your stories. Share them in the comments below because we need to talk about these difficult situations. Need to create a community where people feel empowered to speak the truth even when it's hard. If this story has touched you, if it's made you think about the people in your life differently, if it's given you courage to trust your instincts, please leave a like. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who might need to hear it, who might be facing similar situations and need to know they're not alone. That speaking up is possible even when it's terrifying. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real experiences from people who have lived through unimaginable situations and survived to tell their tales, please subscribe to I Live to Tell. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, because each one we share is a testament to human resilience, to courage in the face of evil, to the power of truth, even when it comes at a tremendous cost. My grandmother used to say that the only way to honor the dead is to live well, to be brave, to stand up for what's right even when it costs you everything. I'm trying to do that every day. I'm trying to be worthy of her legacy and my mother's memory. And I hope that by sharing this story, by being vulnerable about the pain and the healing process, I can help someone else find the courage to trust themselves, to speak up, to fight for justice no matter how impossible it seems. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community where we can share our truths, our traumas, our triumphs. Remember, you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and your voice matters. Use it. Trust it. It might just save a life.